Videos like this are made possible by my wonderful supporters on Patreon. Check the link below if you'd like to join them, and even get access to exclusive content. Complaining about Gran Turismo is one of my specialities, and when it comes to the current state of the franchise, I feel like there's no shortage of things to criticize. I made my thoughts on Gran Turismo 7 pretty clear through my GT Critique series a few years back, and whilst a lot of my gripes with the game were things that I felt were pretty important, that wasn't true for all of them. One video in that series was dedicated to all of the small, annoying things that you could encounter. The sort of stuff that felt too minor to highlight on their own, but when put together, did feel significant enough to talk about. However, it would be a lie to say that things like these are exclusive to GT7. The truth is that every GT game has its own foibles, some of which span across multiple titles, and even the series as a whole. Now I should be clear that I'm not talking about glitches or limitations caused by the hardware. What I mean are deliberate design choices and minor oversights. These can take the form of unnecessary restrictions, strange inconsistencies, and plenty more. Even for someone like myself, who revels in discussing the more obscure and unusual aspects of these games, these are things that are so easy to overlook that I've never covered them in any of my videos. So let's correct that by diving into my Gran Turismo pet peeves. Small things that annoy me more than they realistically should. I've got things to talk about from across each of the games, right through to the current iteration. Okay, we're starting off with something really minor that only applies to Gran Turismo 2. In this game, each of the dealerships are sorted into cities. There are 4 in total. North City has British and German cars, East City features Japanese brands, South City is where you'll find the American-made machines, and West City is for French and Italian models. Each of these cities are laid out on the main menu where you'd expect them to be given their names. But therein lies the problem for me. When you look at it from the perspective of a world map, North City and East City make perfect sense, representing brands from Northern Europe and Japan, aka the Far East. But as for the other two, geographically they don't really work. West City has cars from Southern Europe, and South City has brands from the US, or the Wild West you could say. Basically, when looking at the main menu as a Eurocentric map, the kind that's used across most of the world, the dealerships in West City and South City should be the other way around. Now, I imagine that if you grew up playing this game, the placement of the dealerships would be second nature, and so this isn't something that you would even think twice about. But personally, as someone who only picked up GT2 many years later, it still sometimes throws me off. The number of times I've wanted to go to a US dealer and instinctively scroll over to West City, only to get a face full of Fiat and Citroen, is more than I'd care to admit. With GT4, they revived the concept of dealerships being placed on a map, and in that case, each country is exactly where you would expect them to be. European brands in the middle, Asia-Pacific ones to the east, and North American in the west. A feature that can be found in the original Gran Turismo, and has since been carried through into every numbered entry, is the car wash. Much like changing your oil, the ability to wash your car is a cornerstone of this series. Without it, it would feel like something is missing. However, for a car wash to have any effect, your car first has to get dirty, and that's where there's some contention. In the first 4 numbered entries, cars simply don't get dirty. Instead, driving them will cause their paint to become duller, and by washing them, you're able to restore the shininess. It's also suggested that having a less shiny car affects aerodynamics by increasing drag, and thus making their top speed worse. I'll be honest, this isn't something that I've tested myself, but people have reported this being true in the PS2 games. Moving on to the PS3 era, cars were finally able to become dirty, but only in specific ways. As you would expect, driving on dirt and snow was the easiest way to see this effect, but it's limited only to that session. The moment you finish and quit, the car would revert back to its clean state. There is a more permanent dirty condition, but this is entirely linked to the distance driven between washes, and not whether the car actually got dirty whilst on track. This effectively makes it an extension of the shiny versus dull paint difference of the previous entries, just now it's more noticeable as you'll see this greyish-brown tinge. This detail carries over to the other races and menus, and by washing the car, you can restore it back to the clean state. Whilst GT Sport doesn't have a car wash, it is still possible for your cars to get dirty. When driving on dirt tracks, it's very obvious, but once again, this disappears the moment you exit the race. However, there was also a more permanent dirt effect which I encountered around the game's launch. I had a Lexus RCF GT3 that I drove quite regularly, and it started to build up a brown tint on its lower half that even appeared in menus. After a while though, it just went away, and I never saw anything like it on any of my cars again, so maybe it was patched out at some point. With GT7, the car wash returned, but it seemed even more redundant than in some of the previous entries. Permanent dirt buildup is nowhere to be seen. It's possible that paintwork becomes less shiny over time, as in the PS1 and PS2 games, but to be honest, I've never noticed the difference. I assume that it must do something. After all, GT7 does literally force you to wash one of your cars to complete the game. In late 2025, the Spec 3 update added more detailed grime buildup in longer races, such as oil stains and chunks of discarded rubber. These effects were added mainly to tie in with the endurance races featured in the Power Pack DLC, but they are present outside of those too. However, yet again, this is only a temporary state, with your car returning back to pristine condition once you leave the track. In discussing all of that, I think my gripe should be pretty obvious. If you have a feature that allows players to clean their cars, why not let the on-track dirt buildup carry over so that washing your car actually makes a significant difference? Some may argue that having to clean your car regularly if you want to keep it in top condition would be inconvenient. But newsflash, that's the point. If your cars aren't getting dirty, then why have a car wash at all? It would be like oil deterioration only occurring in longer races, and then the moment you finish, it just reverts back to perfect condition. At that point, there would be no reason to allow players to even change their oil. When it comes to the car wash, that's pretty much the exact scenario we see in GT7. Being able to change your car's wheels has been an option ever since GT2. In fact, in GT2 and GT3, it was the only cosmetic modification you could even make. If you wanted to, you could fit new rims to pretty much any car, with there only being a handful of exceptions to that rule. But for Gran Turismo 4, that was no longer true. In this game, the vast majority of race cars simply cannot have their wheels changed. Cars that could receive aftermarket rims in the previous game were suddenly unable to fit those same wheels for no obvious reason. And this change wasn't limited to just this game either. Moving on to GT5, the same situation would play out. Models that are designated as racing cars cannot have custom wheels. In fact, there were even a few road cars which were stuck with their stock wheel design. The Bugatti Veyron is a pretty infamous example. This trend would continue into GT6, until the transition onto the PS4 suddenly made Polyphony remember that this restriction was pointless, and the ability to put custom wheels on race cars finally returned. However, in current day, there is still a limitation when it comes to many of the Group 1 prototypes, which is kinda lame. As for why race cars were omitted entirely in GT4, 5, and 6, your guess is as good as mine. It was possible to change their wheels before, and it's since been possible to change them after, so I really can't think of any logical reason for them to do this. Just some classic Gran Turismo nonsense, I suppose. But wait, this isn't the only wheel-related frustration that you can have with the PS3 games. Using normal road cars in rally events has been possible ever since GT2, as many of them are able to fit gravel and later snow tyres. In GT4, you have the ability to choose a different wheel design depending on the compound of tyre your car is currently using, whether that be standard and sports, racing, dirt, or snow. Well, for GT5, they made it so that if you equipped dirt or snow tyres to any road car, it would always have this wheel design. These OZ Racing rally wheels are exclusive to dirt and snow tyres, and so cannot be selected outside of them. I believe that the aim of this was most likely to add a bit more authenticity by making it so that you always have an appropriate rally-style wheel fitted when driving on loose surfaces. But even so, it once again comes across as an unnecessary limitation. Why not just have these wheels as an option instead of hard-coding them to the dirt and snow tyres? On a lot of cars, they honestly look kinda terrible, and I know that they've even put some people off from doing rally entirely. Once again, post GT6 they saw some sense, and now when you fit dirt or snow tyres, the wheel design stays exactly as it is. On the topic of annoying things that are specific to only GT5 and 6, there is one more that I'd like to highlight. Typically, when you finish a race in one of these games, you'll automatically be shown a replay. This was true all the way back in the PS1 days, and is still the case now in GT7. Notably, with the transition to the PS3, the replay system became a lot more sophisticated. You can now skip further ahead, as well as pause, use the free camera, and even take pictures in photo mode. Much like in previous games, upon finishing a race, you get shown the replay. But curiously, the replay feature used here is much more simplistic. The only thing you can do is change the camera angle. This means that if you want to use the full replay system to skip ahead, look at opponent cars, take photos, etc., you have to exit out of this replay, load back into the race menu, and then scroll over to replay and wait for that to load. This might sound inconsequential, but having to do this every single time you want to check a replay gets so tedious. Frankly, what annoys me the most is the fact that this situation was totally avoidable. Why does this neutered automatic replay even exist? It serves absolutely no purpose. I can only imagine that it was a carryover from the PS2 games, where the replay system had much less functionality. With GT Sport, they removed the automatic replay, and although it returned in GT7, they did implement the all-too-obvious solution. The automatic post-race replay is just the normal replay with all of the same options and abilities. Although it is worth noting that in GT7, the replay you get shown after a license test or driving mission doesn't allow you to do anything other than change the camera angle. So if you want to have a deeper look, then you have to go through the same process as in the PS3 games. Whilst GT Sport wasn't subject to the previous issue, it did manage to introduce its own annoying replay quirk. The problem can be seen in the footage you're watching right now. Not sure what I mean? Well, let's compare this replay to the actual gameplay. See the difference? For some unknown reason, Polyphony decided to add black bars to the top and bottom of the screen during replays. Now, you might be familiar with a concept in the world of filmmaking known as letterboxing. Basically, as films are typically produced to a wider aspect ratio than the 16:9 of most modern screens, displaying them on those 16:9 screens without stretching or cropping the image results in it not fully filling out the screen area. This means that the black bars you see are effectively the leftover space in between. This phenomenon is not at all related to what's happening in GT Sport. In this case, the aspect ratio is exactly the same as during gameplay. Instead, black bars have been artificially added over the top, thus cropping the image vertically. To summarize, letterboxing allows you to see more of the image, whereas in GT Sport, you actually see less. Once again, I have no explanation for why they did this. It just looks awful. In fact, there's another aspect that makes this even worse. Outside of gameplay, meaning during replays and also every single menu, GT Sport has this weird black border around the screen. Now, if your only experience of this game is through my videos, then you would have never seen this before, because I always make sure to slightly zoom the image in so that it's no longer visible. Having to do this for menus and replays but not gameplay is pretty annoying, but I make the effort just because I hate seeing it that much. Just like with the black bars, this is something that only exists in GT Sport. They weren't present in any of the games before it, and having since removed them in GT7, hopefully we won't see them in any of the games after it. By this point, you've likely already heard the complaint about Gran Turismo's stiff chase camera. The issue is that because it's so rigidly fixed to the back of your car, it makes it difficult to fully understand how the car is moving. For many people, this is a pretty well-known issue with not just GT4, but many of the games that come after it. But alongside altering the movement of the chase cam, GT4 also introduced a new camera angle entirely. Prior to the introduction of cockpit view in the PS3 games, this roof cam was the closest thing to it. It stands somewhere in between the first-person bumper cam and third-person chase cam, and has gone on to appear in every GT game since then. I think it's fair to say that out of the 4 major camera views, roof cam is easily the most forgotten. A lot of people are used to bumper cam as it's what the game chooses by default, those who prioritize immersion prefer cockpit view, and the rest of the fanbase opt for the more accessible chase cam. From what I can tell, players that use roof cam are in the minority, and that possibly explains some of the strangest things about it. For one, why does this view not have a virtual mirror like bumper cam does? I know that among the players who use it, this is the #1 gripe they have with roof cam. I remember this being a very hot topic in the early days of the FIA championships on GT Sport, as not having a mirror makes it much harder to race cleanly. Of course, radar does help, but it still isn't a replacement. In fact, I seem to recall esports players actually bringing this up with Gran Turismo, and their response being that because roof cam gives you a greater field of view, having a virtual mirror on top of that would be unfair. Somehow. As someone who normally uses bumper cam, I have no problem with roof cam, cockpit view, and even chase cam having a virtual mirror as well. It just seems like Gran Turismo being stubborn for no reason. Now, to my second point, I know that I have been calling this view roof cam, but that description isn't always true. In fact, in some of the games, it's officially known as bonnet view. You see, the placement of the camera is quite inconsistent across the many different cars. For example, let's compare two similar Group C prototypes in GT7, the Porsche 962C and Mazda 787B. As you can see, on the Porsche, this camera is very clearly mounted above the roof area. But if we switch over to the Mazda, it's not even close. The POV is much lower down, fixed somewhere around the windscreen. The most drastic difference is just how much more space the Mazda takes up in this view compared to the Porsche. You'd be forgiven for thinking that the 787B was twice the size of the 962C. Many racing games include both a bonnet cam and a roof cam, but Gran Turismo seems to just think they're one in the same, and alternates between them with no real rhyme or reason. Alongside this, there are certain cars where the camera is angled quite sharply downwards, with no obvious explanation. To be honest, even the default bumper cam has its problems. For example, in GT7, a lot of the Formula cars have the viewpoint mounted very low to the ground. You can argue that they're just trying to mirror the low-slung nature of these cars, but personally, it changes the feel of the view completely. In fact, I think that might be part of the reason why I don't really enjoy driving these cars in GT7. I'm not sure if that's a common opinion or not, so let me know. To summarise, the stiff chase cam is merely just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to camera issues in Gran Turismo. In spite of this series' attention to detail, it's just something that they never seem to get right. The roof cam, bonnet cam, windscreen cam, or whatever you want to call it, really is the epitome of this afterthought. Speaking of afterthoughts, it's quite incredible to think that it took all the way until Gran Turismo 5 in 2010 for players to finally be able to repaint their cars. Up until that point, the colour you chose from the dealership was permanent. Of course, that's assuming that you chose the colour at all, because if you bought it used, or won it as a prize, you would have no say in the matter. It's fair to say that customization has come a long way since then, but even now, there is still one colour-related decision that you can't change. As well as choosing the paint of a car when you buy it, in some cases you're also able to choose the interior colour. In Gran Turismo, this is what I like to call a shadow feature, a part of the game that technically does exist, but is never actually referenced within the game itself. How this all works is that depending on which exterior paint you choose, the game assigns a specific interior colour to go with it. The interior colour itself isn't mentioned, so the only way you would know about the different options is by seeing how the interior changes as you cycle through each of the paint colours. This shadow feature has been part of the series for longer than you might think. Maybe you remember seeing it in the PS3 games, as the introduction of cockpit view put a much greater emphasis on car interiors. But in actuality, the first game in the series to have different interior specs for certain cars was GT4. This game debuted modelled interiors for select cars, most notably convertibles, and many of them had different interior colours that changed depending on the selected paints, just like in current day. Back then, that would have been a really cool piece of attention to detail. Even now it's something that most racing games don't bother with. The only disappointment is that you can't mix and match the paint with the interior to create your perfect spec, like you can in, say, Test Drive Unlimited. I suppose that you can technically do this post GT4 by changing the paint colour after the fact, but it still seems like a missed opportunity in my opinion. But the bigger consequence of interior colours only being partially implemented is that once you've acquired the car, you can never change it. Given that repainting the outside is so simple, it just seems kinda bizarre that you can't do anything about the inside. In this respect, what would otherwise be a neat detail can end up just being a mild inconvenience. For example, if you want to repaint the car but find that the interior colour no longer fits, the only thing you can do is buy another version of that car with a different interior. It doesn't take a genius to realise that allowing players to change the interior colour after purchase would be a much better solution. Worse still, in GT7 there are a few cars that have parts of their interior colour-coded to their factory paints, but when you repaint them, the interior doesn't change. This surely must be an oversight, because if not, it would be some expert-level trolling on Polyphony's behalf. I suppose that if you're unsure, the safest thing to do is get the car in a neutral colour combo, so that regardless of how you repaint it down the line, the interior won't stand out. Alright, so I have to say that whilst the entries we've looked at thus far were rooted in objective truths about these games, this next one is far more subjective. I am convinced that the AstroTurf in GT7 has considerably less grip than it does in real life. In case you don't know, AstroTurf is the artificial grass that's sometimes used at racetracks to line the runoff areas. Now, I'll admit that I have never driven on a racetrack in real life that uses AstroTurf in the same way that I have in Gran Turismo. But what I have done is watch a lot of real life racing, and this is what my comparison is mainly centered on. In Gran Turismo, driving over the AstroTurf is like driving over sheet ice. It has no grip at all. If you want to understand what I mean, load up Suzuka in GT7 or even GT Sports. This track has AstroTurf on the outside of many of its trickiest corners. Turn 1, Spoon Curve, and 130R just to name a few. And if you have the misfortune of barely touching it with a loaded outside tyre, then it's game over. They make an already difficult circuit even harder than it needs to be. In my opinion, this track is easily the worst affected by it. I suppose that the irony of this is that in real life, the AstroTurf isn't even there anymore. Looking at this from a conceptual standpoint, why would real-life racetracks have their fastest corners lined with effectively Mario Kart banana peels? It just makes no sense at all, and leads me to believe that the effects of it are somewhat exaggerated in Gran Turismo. Sticking with GT7, let's now talk about an always exciting topic: fuel economy. Fuel usage has been part of this series ever since GT4, and functions pretty much as it does in real life. Generally, heavier and more powerful cars use more fuel. That's easy to understand. But there is one aspect that seems rather counterintuitive. In GT7, road cars tend to run out of fuel a lot quicker than race cars do. Let's compare the Porsche Cayman GT4 with its Group 4 racing version, the GT4 Club Sports. Both cars make identical power, and their other specs are pretty similar. When driving a deep forest with fuel consumption set to ×10, the road car can do 10.3 miles on one tank, or just shy of 4 laps. The race car on the other hand can manage 18 miles, nearly 7 laps in total. Trying to apply real-life logic, this makes no sense at all. How could a production car use more fuel than its track-only racing version when they're both being driven in the same way? Well, the prevailing theory goes that this is the game's way of simulating the race car being able to carry more fuel. In real-life racing, cars often have separate fuel cells, which A, are stronger in the event of a crash, and B, allow the car to go further on a single tank. In Gran Turismo, whilst every car has a nominal 100-litre fuel tank, the difference in fuel consumption between race cars and road cars seems to imply that that's not strictly true. The reason why this is so frustrating is because it's the only true distinction in this game between race cars and road cars. When thinking back to the racing modifications of the PS1 games, in GT7 there are enough tuning and customization options to effectively racing modify any road car you want to. In many cases, you can make your car look and drive like a bespoke racer, but if you actually try and compete against them, you'll find that your tank empties much quicker than theirs. Basically, you have all the tools you need to turn a road car into a race car, except for fuel economy, the most innocuous thing. The solution here is, I think, deceptively simple. All they would need to do is add a racing fuel tank upgrade to the tuning shop that improves the fuel economy of any road car up to that of an equivalent race car. By doing this, we would be able to achieve near parity between officially designated race cars and highly upgraded road cars. This would open up the number of viable cars for each event, and make the game more interesting as a result. When it comes to races where fuel economy is a factor, in GT6 you'll find them in the super events, which are effectively mini endurances. However, they're able to showcase one very strange quirk that I've never seen from any other game in this series. As you can see, I have a 100% completed save file, as I've already won every single race in the career. But now let's redo one of these super events and proceed to not win. After loading back into the event menu, you can see that where it says your record, it now shows the result from the race I just did, and not the first place that was already there. But it gets even weirder. If we head back over to the status menu, what was once a gleaming 100% seal has now regressed to 99%. I think you should be able to see what happened here. By losing super event races that you previously won, you can actually undo your total game progress. Now, there are some caveats to this. For instance, it doesn't apply to every single super event. For the sake of this video, I tried to get it to work on the race at Willow Springs, but it simply wouldn't. At the same time, apparently there are also a few other events that exhibit the same behaviour, such as the Novice Championship. I haven't tested every single event in this game, so it's likely that there are more as well. As far as I know, something like this is not possible in any other Gran Turismo. In case you were wondering, doing this doesn't remove the stars you've earned from that event, so fundamentally it doesn't make a difference. This is something that I only discovered recently when I was replaying some of these races, and to be fair, I am almost certain that it's a glitch. Regardless, because it's such an obscure issue, I still felt like it was worth covering here. If you're stuck on 99% completion in GT6 and don't know why, it's possible that this is the reason. Okay, now here's a question. What do Gran Turismo 3, 6, and Sport all have in common? The answer is that they're the only mainline games to not include a used car dealership in any form. Used cars have been a staple of this series from the very beginning, often providing some good budget options in the early game. As such, their absence from these three titles does take away something from the experience. But what if I were to tell you that the lack of used cars in this trio of games actually has a benefit in one very specific way? Starting with GT3, the mileage of each car you own is tracked and visible at all times. The main reason for this is because the game introduced distance-related mechanics, such as oil changes and engine deterioration. But at the same time, it's also just interesting to know how far you've driven each of your cars. When used cars returned with GT4, each of them were given a pre-existing mileage figure. This was done for two reasons. One, to further the idea of them having already lived a life before this, and two, to give the player a rough idea of their condition. But what this also means is that if you buy one and start driving it, there's no way to know how much of its total mileage was done by you, and how much was already there when you bought it. The only way to find out would be to make a note of its mileage before you buy it, and then calculate the difference between that and its current mileage, but that's far from convenient. In the subsequent games that also track mileage and have used cars, so just GT5 and GT7, this is still the case. If you own used cars, there is no way to know for certain which car you have driven the most. Let's compare GT Sport and GT7 in this regard. In the former, you can clearly see that my most driven car is the 2016 Honda NSX GT500, with almost 5,200 miles on the clock. But when talking about the latter, it's not so simple. The highest mileage car that I own is a BMW 3-litre CSL with over 62,000 miles, but only a handful of those were done by me, if any. When it comes down to the cars that I know I've driven a lot, then it would probably be this Ferrari 365 with 1,958 miles. But given that I bought it from the Legends dealers with a few miles already on it, I don't know if it's actually my most driven car. As for the rest of the order, I'm not even going to try and work it out. Once again, I feel like there's a very obvious solution to this problem. Just remove the used car dealership. No, I'm kidding, don't worry. I'm almost certain that internally the game tracks how far the player has driven each of their cars, separately from the car's overall mileage. So, just make this stat visible under its own separate category called Distance Driven by Player. A simple solution for a simple problem. Personally, I think the more stats we can track, the better. And speaking of not being able to know certain information about your cars, that's also the subject of my final topic. There's a certain trope in Gran Turismo that pervades pretty much all of the games, and yet rarely ever gets talked about. Although these games normally revel in brandishing all of the nitty-gritty details on each car, there are cases where they withhold some information. There are several different variations on how and why they do this. For example, the most common specs that you're likely to see left blank are for engine layout and displacements. For the vast majority of cars which this applies to, they fall into one of two camps. Either they're a fictional racing model created for the game, or they're a concept car. Or both, I guess. I suppose the idea is that with the former, because they're not real cars, they don't feel the need to specify that information. With the latter, that same idea could also apply, given that many concepts exist as merely show models, and so don't have finalized engine specs. The same logic could carry over to cars that have their dimensions like length and width omitted as well. But the rabbit hole that is hidden car specs goes much deeper than just this. In GT3, none of the cars have their model years listed. This is kind of odd, but arguably how GT2 handles this is even stranger. Here, some cars do have model years, but others don't, with there not seeming to be any clear reason for this divide. For my money, the strangest hidden stats can be found specifically in GT4. There are a handful of cars which don't have their drivetrain layouts listed, and once again, it's a very odd selection. Sure, there are unfinalized concepts like the Nissan GTR, which is somewhat understandable, but also a number of real cars like the Audi TTR touring car, Nissan 350Z, and strangest of all, the 1998 Nissan Cube. Oh, and in case you're wondering, because their drivetrains aren't listed, they're unable to enter any of the respective drivetrain events. This is really weird, but I don't think it was intentional. Some of the cars which hide their drivetrain layouts, such as this 350Z, also have alternate variants which don't. To me, this seems to imply that the lack of listed drivetrain was simply a mistake. But when it comes to hidden stats, the two that are most impactful are power and weight. These figures are fundamental to our understanding of a car's performance, so not being able to see either of them is pretty inconvenient. Now, I should mention that when it comes to hidden car stats, there are two variations of this. The first are stats that are hidden at all times. Most of the examples I've already covered fall under this category. However, there are also cars which have some stats obscured when viewing them in the dealership, but once you actually acquire them, they get revealed. A lot of cars that have their power and weight withheld work in this way. When looking at the older games, and cars which appear in the dealership but you can't actually buy, not knowing these specs isn't really a big deal. However, for the ones in which the only way to get them is to buy them, it's pretty stupid. I mean, power and weight are arguably the two most important things when it comes to deciding whether to buy a car or not. I think the PS3 games are particularly bad for this. There are so many models with hidden stats. Not just original race cars and concepts, but also IRL racers, and even just regular production cars. I really don't understand what purpose there is to not letting players have this information until they already own the car. In fact, many of these models have these stats mentioned in their descriptions, so it really is just an extra layer of inconvenience for no reason. But with that, we now reach the final boss of hidden car specs, when the power and/or weight never gets revealed even after purchase. Examples of these are few and far between, but they do exist, pretty much all of them being concept cars. Whilst you may associate hidden specs with the older games, this is actually still a thing in current day. GT7 includes a handful of models with no power or weight figures listed, such as the Toyota FT1. But of course, even though we can't see them, cars like this obviously must have power and weight figures coded to them, otherwise they wouldn't function in the game. And wouldn't you know, there is actually a way to find out these specs without having to dive into the code. In your garage, if you sort your cars by power and weight, even though it'll still appear as just dashes, the car will be listed relative to the others which do have visible stats. This gives you a rough idea of where it stacks up, and also means that you can then adjust the specs of the cars around it to pinpoint the exact figure. Well, either that, or you could just look up this information online, but that's not as interesting. As for why cars like these have their stats hidden at all times, that's yet another mystery. Is it possible that these figures are just unofficial numbers made up by the devs, or that the manufacturers simply don't want them to be public knowledge? Unfortunately, we can only speculate. But with that, we've reached the checkered flag. Through watching this video, I imagine that you'll experience one of two possible outcomes to each of my points. Either you would feel a certain amount of catharsis in my highlighting these annoying things that simply don't get talked about very often, in which case, you're welcome. Or alternatively, you'll now be aware of a bunch of small annoying things in these games that you'll never be able to unnotice. And if that's true, then I do apologise. Either way, I definitely feel more relieved having been able to finally vent these frustrations, which until now I've kept to myself. But as we know, this series is not lacking in strange design choices, inconsistencies, and limitations, so tell me all about your personal Gran Turismo pet peeves down below. For now, thanks for watching, and have a good one.